Of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Pursuant to the orders of reference of April 11 and May 26, 2020, the committee is resuming its study of the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. The website will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, please click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to please use the language channel of the language they are speaking. I would now like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. With us today, we have appearing from l'Association des groupes des réseaux techniques du Québec, Eric Simon, Director General, and from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, we have Tim Richter, President and CEO. Monsieur Simon, vous avez la parole pour 10 minutes.
Monsieur Simon, you have the chair for 10 minutes. You have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for allowing us to speak and to highlight the importance of housing during the current crisis. I'll start by introducing ourselves. The AGRTQ is an association that brings together 25 technical resource groups, or TRGs, that serve all of Quebec. The GRTs are social economy enterprises that for over 40 years have supported the creation of more than 85,000 housing units in the form of cooperatives and housing NPOs, representing more than half of Quebec's social housing stock. They also have to their credit many collective real estate projects, including multifunctional community centers and CPEs. We've been at the heart of housing project development for over 40 years. We are present at every stage of the process, from the recognition of needs to project support, through the implementation strategy and financial arrangements, site supervision, group training, and real estate and financial management. TRGs act as a catalyst to carry out housing projects that meet the varied needs of most vulnerable populations. If there's one thing that the coronavirus pandemic has taught us well, it's the importance of staying home to prevent the spread of the virus. Across the country, people have done that. But it's important to remind ourselves that too many people do not have a home. Too many families have substandard, expensive housing that is simply not suited to their condition or reality. We've seen the great mobilization for food banks because more and more people can no longer afford to feed themselves without making the connection that it's probably because they have to spend a disproportionate amount of their income on housing. Giving families adequate and affordable housing means better food, clothing, and better health. It also means making them less vulnerable and thus protecting them from a future pandemic. What we've observed during the pandemic and what all studies show is the advantage of community housing to respond quickly to a crisis, such as the one we are experiencing. Co-housing communities are collectively owned and democratically governed. This makes them small communities where people know each other and help each other. This is empowering and makes all residents responsible for their own well-being and increases their desire and ability to act. It is a good protection against a virus, but also against the daily vicissitudes of life. There are close to 1.7 million households in Canada in core housing need. That is 306,000 units in Quebec. This is shameful. It is easy to predict that the current crisis will increase the needs. A massive investment in community housing is an excellent way to prepare for the next pandemic. So you have to ask yourself the question, why has this not already been done? What's interesting about this situation is that you, as elected MPs, would not accept that your citizens do not have access to the education system. You wouldn't accept that the people in your riding wouldn't have access to health care. So why do you accept that such a crucial and essential need as housing is problematic for nearly 13% of the population in the country? The good news for you is that as part of the economic recovery, investment in community housing also pays off. Each dollar invested in the development of community housing in Quebec generates 2.3 in economic activity. Using community and social housing as a way out of the crisis is what we are asking you to do. And we're not alone, and that is what we and some 20 organizations outside of the housing sector are asking. Chambers of Commerce, real estate developers, foundations, Chantier de l'économie sociale, municipal organizations, to name but a few, all believe that for the economic recovery, this is the way out. The discussions on the pandemic allow us to review our habits, and we must do so by generating more human, greener, and more sustainable projects. We also draw a clear conclusion that support for the primary needs of vulnerable people must not be subject to the private market and profit. The health and safety of the most vulnerable must not be an industry but a government obligation. The models deployed by co-ops and housing NPOs are striking examples of how we can do things differently with one simple objective: the well-being of residents. It is from this perspective that the government must increase its partnerships with the social economy. It's a way to do more, to do better, and all in the interest of the collective. There are many examples, and I invite you to discover them. In Quebec, we have a very particular ecosystem when it comes to housing. During 40 years of partnership and complementarities between cooperatives, housing NPOs, municipal housing authorities, cities and municipalities, the health system, and community groups. It represents the success of our program called Accès Logis. This is a program in co-partnership with the Société d'Habitation du Québec, or the Quebec Housing Association. It's the success of collective ownership that guarantees housing affordability over time. It is your role to support and consolidate this. So how? First of all, we would like to stress the importance of the federal government's return to funding housing. After a 20-year absence, the establishment of the National Housing Strategy has been welcomed. For the very principle of the government's contribution to take leadership and invest in addressing a major problem. Also appreciated for having developed a strategy with a long-term perspective and planning. We know that it takes time to develop housing and mobilize communities, especially for the most vulnerable. During the past few weeks, pressure has been growing for a housing agreement to be signed between Quebec and the federal government, the last province to wait for money from the housing strategy. And many people seem to be hoping that the solution lies in that money. But I want to begin by saying that we do not understand why this money has not been distributed for a long time. When the house burns down, you don't ask who owns the water, you just put out the fire. Secondly, this money is necessary and expected, but it is far from being enough. The needs are so great that we need a huge, massive investment. Leadership that will come from all of you, and that the communities will applaud in order to invest in the primary needs of your communities. Throughout the country, housing is growing in importance and becoming a critical issue. Cities and municipalities have been systematically including this in their priorities for the past few years. We hope that you will hear our message so that our next meeting with a committee such as this one will report on the successes achieved and not on a missed appointment. Thank you.
Et merci à vous, Monsieur Simon. Suite
Thank you.
From the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Freudian slip there. Mr. Richter, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the federal government's response to COVID-19. And specifically, I'll speak as it relates to homelessness. I'm going to talk briefly about the federal emergency response to COVID-19, but like my colleague, I'll focus more on the opportunity ahead of us to build a recovery for all. Before COVID-19, we already had a disaster unfolding on our streets that's at the same scale as the biggest natural disasters in Canadian history. Each year, over 235,000 different Canadians experience homelessness. We know that homelessness condemns people to an early death, erasing as much as 25 years off of a person's life and killing untold numbers every year. Toronto's homeless memorial alone lists over 1,000 names. This disaster was man-made. The mass homelessness we see in Canada today is the consequence of federal policy, specifically the elimination of federal affordable housing programs in the 1990s and cuts to social transfers to the provinces. These cuts have been compounded by unchecked and pernicious market forces that have systematically stripped Canada's rental housing market of hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing. The irony in the cuts of the 1990s is that they effectively achieved no savings. They simply shifted the costs onto other parts of the federal and provincial balance sheets, like healthcare, justice, and social services. Homelessness costs over $7 billion per year. People experiencing homelessness are at significantly elevated risk from COVID-19 as a result of serious pre-existing health conditions, crowded living conditions, and poor access to healthcare, and more. Since early March, there's been a mad scramble in homeless services to put in place measures to protect homeless people from COVID-19. Toronto today is the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in the homeless system. There have been about 500 positive cases in 14 outbreaks. To put this in perspective, the entire province of Manitoba had 297 cases. But Toronto so far is the worst of it, in that we haven't yet seen a large-scale outbreaks and loss of life outside of Toronto is a result of several important factors, including incredibly rapid and heroic efforts by frontline workers, expert healthcare leadership from the Canadian Network for Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness, the protection afforded by public health measures that kept most Canadians at home, thus reducing the risk of transmission to people experiencing homelessness, and frankly, people who are homeless fled shelters for the comparative safety of sleeping outside. A critically important factor in the homeless sector's ability to protect people was the responsiveness of the Government of Canada, and specifically Employment and Social Development Canada. Employment and Social Development Canada and the Reaching Home program. Minister Hussein, Parliamentary Secretary Vaughan, and their officials should be specifically recognized and applauded. They were able to get urgently needed flexible funding out to communities rapidly, which has been essential in helping communities prepare and secure everything from personal protective equipment and staffing to hotel rooms for isolation, quarantine, and social distancing. But none of the emergency measures we've put in place are a replacement for a home, and we are by no means out of the woods yet. There are very real risks presented by reopening of the economy. Challenges remain in sustaining protections over a longer term, and very real dangers are posed by a second wave of the virus. Governments across Canada are starting to reopen the economy, and people are talking about getting back to normal. There can be no getting back to normal. Normal was more than 235,000 Canadians per year homeless and at life-threatening risk for no other reason than they were poor and without a home. The time is now for us to not only act urgently to move people in housing as fast as humanly possible, but to build a recovery plan that creates a permanent and sustainable end to homelessness. To that end, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has put forward a 6-point recovery plan for ending homelessness, and that this plan includes 1, a federal commitment with timelines and targets to the prevention and elimination of homelessness, with expanded federal investment in community-based homelessness responses, building on the Reaching Home program, including a national definition of homelessness and specific measures to address homelessness for Indigenous people, veterans, women, and people living in rural and remote communities. As we've seen in the pandemic, that federal leadership is essential and can be highly effective. 2, a national guaranteed minimum income to ensure those in greatest need have a minimum financial resources to help them meet their basic needs and prevent homelessness when times are tough. 3, construction of 300,000 new permanent, affordable, and supportive housing units over 10 years, and enhanced rental support for low-income Canadians to address Canada's housing and homelessness crisis. In creating new housing, the priority should be given to people experiencing homelessness or those at the greatest risk. We should look closely at the expansion of the Canada Housing Benefit to better support prevention of homelessness. 4, meaningful implementation of the right to housing to surface and resolve inequities and systemic or structural barriers that contribute to homelessness and housing need. As the private sector well knows, when you listen to your customers and respond to their needs, you get much more efficiency and better outcomes. This is at the heart of the right to housing. 5, we recommend implementing measures to curtail the impact of financialization of rental housing markets by limiting the ability of large capital funds, including real estate income trusts, to purchase distressed rental housing assets. According to noted housing policy researcher Steve Pomeroy, between 2011 and 2016, the number of private rental units affordable to households earning less than $30,000 per year, so that's rents below $750 a month, declined by 322,600 units. In the same period, federal and provincial affordable housing investments, mainly in BC and Quebec, added fewer than 20,000 new affordable units. So for every one new affordable unit created at considerable public cost, 15 existing private affordable units were lost. Now, if this trend continued to 2020, that means over 480,000 affordable rental units would have been lost. Following the pandemic, there's very real worry that this trend could accelerate, making Canada's housing crisis even worse. If we're in a hole, we have to stop digging. And finally, and importantly, an adequately resourced, number 6, an adequately resourced, distinction-based, urban and rural Indigenous housing and homelessness strategy that is developed and implemented by urban, rural, and northern Indigenous peoples and housing and service providers. Indigenous peoples are approximately 5% of Canada's population, but can account for up to 30% of the homeless population. According to federal shelter data, Indigenous men are 11 times more likely to end up in homeless shelters than non-Indigenous men, and Indigenous women are 15 times more likely to end up in shelter than non-Indigenous women. In every crisis, there is opportunity. We have an opportunity to build back better. We cannot go back to normal, a normal where over 235,000 different Canadians are homeless, where 1.7 million households live in substandard or unaffordable housing, where people are at life-threatening risk for no other reason than they're poor and they don't have a home. Homelessness is the direct result of past policy choices. It's time for us to make better choices. We also know what to do and we know how to do it. We can follow the lead of communities like Edmonton, Calgary, Medicine Hat, Guelph, Chatham, Dufferin, and Durham, and more, who have all achieved large-scale reductions in homelessness. In fact, Montreal is a really good example. Montreal is half the rate of homelessness of Calgary because they kept building affordable housing and supporting people's incomes. Investment in ending homelessness saves money. According to a 2019 report from the City of Edmonton, since 2009, 8,400 people have been housed, and overall homelessness in Edmonton reduced by 43%. In addition, these efforts saved an estimated $920 million in health and justice system costs. Canadian studies have shown that for every $1 spent on Housing First programs, there's more than $2 in savings in health and justice systems. Investing in housing creates jobs. Our proposal to build 300,000 new units of housing over 10 years would create at least 300,000 jobs and stimulate another 3 million jobs elsewhere in the economy. We have an opportunity now to build back better, to accelerate progress on ending homelessness, to address Canada's housing crisis, to create jobs, achieve long-term cost savings, have better social policy, and stimulate the economy. We have the opportunity to build a recovery for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richter. Now we're going to proceed with questions, beginning with the Conservatives. Karen Vecchio for 6 minutes. Ms. Vecchio, you have the floor.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And it's wonderful to see you, Tim, once again, although it's not in person. And thank you for also joining us, Mr. Simone. It's wonderful to speak to you as well. I'm just going to start off with Tim. Just a simple question. The portable housing benefit, has it rolled out? It was supposed to roll out effectively April 1st, 2020, correct? Have we seen any signs of life happening right now, or is it on stall with COVID-19?
My understanding that it is certainly in place in Ontario, and there are agreements in place with most of the provinces. I couldn't speak to whether or not the dollars are landing in people's bank accounts yet. I'm sure there's others on the call that could answer that question.
Yeah. And I'm sure Mr. Vaughn down there will say, Karen, you should be asking me that question. But I was just wondering whether that was actually one of the tools that are being used right now, if that portable benefit is also there to help some of the social programs. Now, we've seen, of course, with COVID-19, there has been a lot of things that have had negative impacts. I've dealt specifically with women's shelters across Canada. What are you seeing specifically to Tim, and then passing it over to Eric? What are you seeing when you're comparing your larger communities to your smaller communities? As you indicated, Tim, COVID is very prevalent in cities like Toronto. We have smaller cases in cities like St. Thomas and London. And then, of course, across the country, the prairies have been very safeguarded. What have you seen for some of the challenges that the homeless are facing, and other things that you're seeing in that rural versus urban split?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the challenges are fairly consistent. It's a difference in scale. I think in a lot of smaller communities, they don't have shelters per se, and so they're scrambling to find alternative arrangements in motels and in other places, community halls, things like that. One of the challenges of COVID-19 is that there hasn't been large-scale testing, so it could be there when we may not see it. Right. So it could be spreading in the community and we don't see it. So it's urgent that we get universal testing and get it as quickly as possible in the communities. But as you point out, one of the challenges we have in the way that federal investment is made is that there isn't, in my view anyway, enough money going to rural communities. And so we benefited, and by we say a lot of the community entities under the Reaching Home program benefited from that rapid federal investment. But there's a lot of communities, a lot of smaller towns that didn't have access to that money just by virtue of the structure of Reaching Home. So we would certainly recommend greater investment in rural Canada.
And Eric, I'm going to pass right over to you, but I did want to follow up with that, Tim, when we're talking about the Reaching Home programs. And you talked about getting some of those federal supplies for PPE, all of those necessities. How was that networked? Was that something directly? Because if we know that there are rural shelters, and sorry, that's my puppy, when we know that there are rural and urban centers that are already having challenges, were we still able to reach all of those rural centers as well that you've been involved in?
I don't know. I think there's still, the rural communities really did struggle with things like PPE and funding for things like isolation shelters or some kind of sheltering arrangements. I know the homeless system, by and large, was able to access PPE only through federal funding, right? Because the provincial infrastructure and emergency response infrastructure really didn't respond to homelessness, certainly didn't prioritize it. So it was really up to those frontline organizations to go get the PPE and the other things they needed, staffing to respond appropriately.
Excellent. Thank you. And over to you, Mr. Simon. Eric, if you could share with me, first of all, you talked about the fact that Quebec has not signed the housing agreement. If you could share with me why not, just some particulars, what's the hold? And also, what are you seeing with the challenges between rural versus urban? I know that in Montreal has had a real epicenter as well of COVID compared to the rest of Quebec. And if you could just share some insight on that and the impact to the homeless.
Well, the first part is about the urban and the community. When we look at the mobilization of people when they are isolated, and that's what we see in big cities. When you see people that don't have a network, a social network to depend on, they don't have neighbors that they know, they don't have groups that they know, they will have difficulties of getting through a crisis like that. And we see that in urban community, it's more difficult. But when they are organized in big projects that are in community housing or in community groups, they have an easy way through those crises. So in the urban community, when we go, not in the urban, but the campaign, like out of the big cities, they do have this network build up naturally, and they do work together naturally. So they respond, and their way to respond for people who are more vulnerable or isolated, it goes much faster. So we have to recreate those networks within big cities. And this is what we do as social housing. When we talk about we're losing as affordable housing throughout the years, because when we put all our money in there, we don't have any guarantee for the future. We just build affordable housing one time, and then it goes down and we lose it through times to speculation or different event. But when we do build community housing, we assure that the affordable housing will be there through time. As long as the building exists and the people within the cooperative or the nonprofit will be there, they'll put the average of the loan as small as possible, and the impact will be as small as possible on their way to pay for their building and their services. So they'll get more services, more network, more community, because they'll be in those kind of houses. So we have to, it's good to have affordable housing, but this is not a national-wide policy that we have to go through. We have to make sure that we build those networks for vulnerable people.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Simon, and thank you,
you.
Ms. Vecchio. Next, we have Mr. Turnbull, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Simon. I've often admired the work that your organizations do. Mr. Richter, I'm going to start with you. I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper on our government, the quickness and flexibility of the government's response during this pandemic. You know, we know that there is $15 million allocated for big cities, 157.5 million to community organizations through the Reaching Home program, 50 million specifically for women's shelters, and then another 350 million for the Emergency Community Support Fund, which I know is not necessarily only targeted towards people who are experiencing homelessness, but certainly deals with some of the organizations that provide many wraparound supports for vulnerable people. Can you speak to just like how responsive do you think the government has been at the federal level, first of all? Maybe a short comment on that one, and I'm going to ask you. I have a few questions.
Well, I think, you know, as I mentioned in my statement, I think the federal government has been, to their credit, very quick and very responsive. You know, I've spoken with, or I speak to Adam and to the Parliament, or to the minister and their staff and the Reaching Home officials regularly. They've moved very, very quickly, and I think, to be honest, that was one of the single most important factors in us for COVID-19 not being much worse than it could have been. And when it first started and we watched what was happening in Italy and places like that, we were very worried that it was going to be every bit as bad as the long-term care crisis. That it hasn't been is due in large measure to how the sectors responded very quickly, and the fact that they had the resources available from the federal government very quickly and in place, and the flexibility, importantly, to use the money where they needed to respond.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know many of our shelters are built in such a way that people are in very close proximity to each other. You know, there's bunk beds. I've worked in several shelters and supportive housing facilities that you know you would think would be a high risk of infection or transmission would be possible. So can you speak to the response? I know in Durham Region, my riding is in Whitby. In Durham Region, they received, I think, an increase in funding of 313%, if I'm not mistaken, through the Reaching Home, and it's really made a difference. Can you maybe just speak to how have, you know, regions or you know, agencies really use those resources to adapt to the realities that they're experiencing on the ground?
Well, they've used the money in several ways, everything from buying personal protective equipment to hiring the staffing necessary. So when you create an isolation shelter, or you set up, you rent rooms at a hotel, you buy a hotel with this money, you still need to staff all of those things. And so they've been able to do that and do it quickly. But importantly, places like Durham have done a really good job of staying focused on housing as well, and using the money to get people out of the shelters, out of those hotels, and into housing. You know, homelessness, it's impossible to protect yourself, really well from COVID-19 when you're in a shelter or you're homeless. The best protection from COVID-19 is a home. And you see that in Durham and other communities where they're using the money as well to move people rapidly into housing.
Thanks. And I know the Toronto Star recently said the homeless population has sidestepped this disaster. Would you say that that's true? And would you say it's a result of some of the supports that we've put out there?
I would say so. I would put a word of caution there is that due to lack of testing, we may not see it all. And given the health that some homeless folks have, what COVID looks like and what they may have, they look very similar. But absent of confirmed testing of everybody in the homeless systems in Canada, yes, I think we can say that it could have been much, much worse. And it's still, we're not out of the woods yet. Like there could be a second wave, and we have to maintain these protections for a bit longer. And we have to focus on housing. Yeah,
I agree completely, but certainly in comparison to our long-term care facilities, the homeless population has fared a lot better than seniors has, given their vulnerability as well. Would you agree that they've? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, but
I think we appear to have fared better than places like Italy, like long-term care. But again, we're not out of the woods yet, and I don't want to brush over the impact that this has had on the homeless system. Like the homeless system, shelter workers, shelter providers are really getting battered. Like it's really getting battered. It's a difficult time for them. But I think I want to make sure that we are really emphasizing the work that the frontline workers have done, really heroic efforts to prevent this from getting truly awful.
I couldn't agree more. It's heroic work, and I don't mean to paint with too broad of a brush there, but thank you for your response. In terms of this 6-point plan that you put forward, there's large capital funds that we know are sort of predatory in the market. They buy up rental housing and either take it off the market or increase the prices so that it's not affordable anymore. And so as you pointed out, we're losing lots of affordable housing, 15 to 1, I think you said, right, in terms of gain to loss, or loss to gain, I should say. Can you tell me what you think we should be doing about that in the future to prevent that predatory behavior, given the fact that it may increase as a result of this pandemic?
Well, short response, please, Mr. Richter, at a time. Yep.
Okay, there's a range of measures. I think we could either set up a fund that allows the nonprofit sector and others to buy up the housing. You look at some in Montreal, the mayor of Montreal created a right of first refusal for the city to buy properties that might be distressed or up for sale. We could do that nationally. And I think we should explore taxation or other regulatory measures to prevent the REITs and large funds from taking over this housing.
Thank you, Mr. Richter, and thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Ensuite, nous avons Monsieur Trudel.
Now we have Mr. Trudel, 6 minutes. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you. And thank you to both witnesses. Right now, my question is for Mr. Simon. We can say that there's a housing crisis, and this has been ongoing in Canada and is also the case in Quebec. And the crisis was there before the pandemic and will no doubt continue. In April, there were 150 households that were not able to pay their mortgage. And so this is an issue. So the issue in Quebec is the signing of the agreement on housing. We know there's 4.5 billion that were spent in Canada, but in Quebec nothing happened. The agreement is not signed. Mr. Simon, the agreement has been blocked, but if we're talking about, well, in housing in Quebec, there's a community approach that is different than the rest of Canada. Could you speak to this? Mr. Simon, before answering, yes, this way. So in the 1990s, the federal government withdrew and Quebec continued to create its own programs to fund community housing. So if we look at the number of co-ops throughout the country, half of them are in Quebec. The federation, the cooperative, the community housing model, all of this has been integrated with all the community partners. When money is provided, I understand that throughout the country, there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. And This is necessary, but when this money arrives in an ecosystem that's already been created and that works quite well, and the first source of an issue is funding, of course, there are tensions. I sincerely believe, and when I said if the house is on fire, you just put out the fire. You don't argue as to who is owning the water. So this is the same. You can have homeless people, people who are single parents. They need 2 or 3 jobs to pay their bills. We need for these people to get out of unsanitary housing. I'm putting the emphasis on the agreement. As Mr. Richter said, these amounts are not sufficient to respond to the needs of a modern society, to respond to the housing requirements. We really have to invest massively. We need more mobilization to house our citizens adequately so that people are not on the streets. Housing is a primary need. Yes, it seems that there's a blocking of negotiations. Money has been sent throughout Canada, but not Quebec. The National Assembly unanimously is saying, even the Minister of Finance in Quebec, Mr. Girard, said this last week, that housing is a provincial jurisdiction. They want the control. So why is it so important that it be Quebec that Quebec is the one to shape the strategy on the Quebec territory? As an ecosystem, it already exists. So we're trying to create a network, a parallel network. So we want to make sure that the money goes into the current ecosystem to respond to the needs. We, in the system, already have 10,000 housing units ready to go to be funded by the government programs. They don't have the funding. It's 180 projects. So if the funding arrives from the federal government, we want it to be sent into this system as quickly as possible. The urgency will allow us also to, it takes 3 years, but if we had the agreement, perhaps we would have housing online very soon. But we don't have this. This agreement, and the quickest way to have housing units is for the funding to be transferred into a system that's working very well. And for housing, even if it's not perfect, even if there's issues, we do have a system that was built in the 1990s and has continued, and this has reduced the pressure for homelessness and in all aspects of lodging. If we're talking about 1.4 billion, if the agreement was signed tomorrow morning, and you said earlier, Mr. Simon, that it's not enough. You said it's not enough to meet the needs in Quebec right now. So if we needed to have a figure, if we were looking at the housing needs for 300,000 people who are living in inadequate housing, the thousands of people who are spending over 80% of their income for housing, this is real poverty. This is a huge misery. So we have to take care of these people. And post-pandemic, it will be the same. So could you tell us what the housing needs are specifically for Quebec over the next few years? Quickly, the average cost of housing where government pays half, the rest is paid by municipality, or it's about 115,000 per housing unit. So we know that there is going to be inflation. Construction costs are going to increase. So these are our figures, actual figures. Costs are rising. So when we're talking about our 10,000 units, this is $1 billion, at least, in investment so that they're able to be built. Thank you, Mr. Simon.
Please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their presentation. Absolutely, it's correct to say that the federal government canceled the National Affordable Housing Program back in 1993, and as a result of that, our country lost more than 500,000 units of affordable housing. And just to take that for a minute, Quebec and British Columbia were the only provinces that carried on with housing initiatives. And so consequently, we have the crisis that we have today, even before COVID-19. With that being said, in terms of dealing with the situation, while it's good that there were some monies that went out to reaching homes to some community groups, I also want to note, though, too, that many other organizations that do not receive funding from government did not receive any support. And so consequently, they were struggling in trying to find personal protective equipment and other measures to support people who are in need of housing. Now, going forward, I wonder what are your thoughts with respect to the National Co-Investment Fund program. Right now, as it stands, it is hugely stuck in the bureaucracy. Many of the projects didn't get approved. If we're to build 300,000 units of affordable housing, Mr. Director, what do we need to do to fix the situation in order that we can get the housing actually built on the ground?
Well, I think there's three things that I would do. First, I would effectively double the National Housing Strategy investment. I would move the investment forward, so a lot of the money is spent over time, with more of it at the back end than at the front end. I think you need to move that forward. And I think one of the challenging things in the design of the co-investment fund is that it doesn't have specific prioritization for people experiencing or at greatest risk of homelessness. So you end up spending a little bit of money a mile wide and an inch deep. Like, in order to achieve rapid success and protect the people at greatest need or whose life is at risk from homelessness and those in the most extreme core housing need, I think you need to prioritize the investment to those in the greatest need. So first on homelessness and those in extreme core housing need, and target the investment fairly precisely. It's also a fairly challenging program to get through. So the application is 200 plus pages. In our sector, there's not a lot of organizations that have the ability to do the housing and to do all the work that goes into that. So some work and some investment, which I know has been done on capacity in the homelessness and housing systems around the country. Not everybody has Quebec's history and has Quebec's experience in developing housing. BC and Quebec, I think, are probably about the furthest ahead in their ability to use the money appropriately.
Well, thank you. Even then, I think that there has been a challenge in terms of moving programs forward and projects forward, more to the point, to get that housing in place. I want to ask this question. As it stands right now with COVID-19, many people are homeless. Actually, in British Columbia, they are. And our provincial government has been very proactive in trying to do something around that. They actually went ahead and purchased an old hotel or motel, if you will. The federal government provided $0 towards that. If we're to actually escalate the availability of housing for people who are homeless, those who are most urgent need, who have the most urgent need, what role do you think the government should play in terms of helping communities, provinces, municipalities, NGOs purchase these assets? Do they need to contribute money, or should they just sort of remain business as usual?
Well, I think the federal government has a very important leadership role in housing and in ending homelessness in Canada. That's why we've been asking for that leadership and supporting the National Housing Strategy. I think there are no silver bullets in ending homelessness, right? Like there's a lot of different housing form. You could take and buy and convert a hotel. You could use modular housing, like BC has done very well. You can build new permanent supportive housing. There's a range of options that are unique to a community and the opportunities that are there. And so I would say the federal government has a role to play in working with the provinces, and like in Quebec, where they have their own approach. I think it's a partnership between the federal government and the provinces. And if BC needs federal investment to purchase and convert hotels or develop affordable housing, that's subject to a negotiation between British Columbia and the federal government. But the federal government needs to have that leadership role, in my opinion, to say, look, we are going to eliminate homelessness in Canada. We're going to prioritize our resources to achieving that objective, and we're going to make the funding investments necessary, but also understanding that provinces, when we think about the cost savings of ending homelessness, provinces are actually the net beneficiaries. It's provincial health systems, justice systems, social systems that will save the money. So there has to be a push for provinces to also invest along with the federal government.
Well, absolutely. And some provinces are more ready and willing and able to do so than others. It is not a fixed formula. Not every province should engage in the same formula, if you will, in terms of that. British Columbia, for example, is asking for the federal government to contribute 50% towards the contributions to in the purchase of hotels in developments, whether it be any other kind of development in terms of address the homelessness crisis. But in other communities, 50% may not work for them, right? Especially in the smaller communities with more limited resources, for example. So I think flexibility is the name of the game, isn't it? In terms of moving forward, I'd like to ask Mr. Simone that question, because I think Quebec has led the way in terms of this effort.
Réponse courte, s'il vous plaît.
Very short answer. There's no more time left.
Is definitely the answer, because with the co-investment that we have, we're trying to make two programs work together, and they don't. So we're trying to get the Axology and to fund the program. We're trying to go to the co-investment to get the money that we missed, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work easily. We have to, because it doesn't work the same way throughout Canada. So we have to make the flexibility to make sure that we can help fast and easily those communities to get those projects up.
Thank you, Mr. Simone. Thank you, Ms. Kwan. Next, we're going to go to Ms. QC, please, for 5 minutes. You're on mute there, Ms. QC.
Me, it's my first day with my Surface Pro. Thank you both, our witnesses, for being here today. My first question is to Mr. Richter. I'd like to know if he sees an increase in homelessness as the economy reopens following the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think there is a very real risk of that, as COVID-19 seems to be impacting more those at lower income and with more precarious employment. I think when we see the eviction bans lift, we see the CERB stops at some point, and the income support stop, I think we may well see a surge in homelessness. The Americans are apparently worried about a 40% increase in homelessness as a result of COVID-19. Similar analysis hasn't been done here, but I think it's certainly a very real risk, which is one of the reasons we're arguing for increased investment in the housing benefits. So, for example, that money can get in people's pockets very quickly and keep people housed. The vast majority of people on waiting lists for housing are waiting in housing that they can't afford.
So would you say that the increase would be amongst those who chronically face homelessness, or would you say that these are individuals who will have fallen upon tough times as a result of COVID-19 and will be able to rebound and rebuild? Because, of course, as we plan our response, we have to consider the situations that Canadians are in.
I think it could be both. For the vast majority of people, about 85% of people who experience homelessness in Calgary and across Canada, they're in and out really quickly, and it's usually a disruption in income of some form, a loss of a job or something like that, and they usually can resolve it themselves fairly quickly. But it could also be that we end up creating a new surge in chronic homelessness a bit further down the road, as people who are struggling with different disabilities or different challenges, who would struggle to get themselves out of homelessness, fall into the system, and they may get trapped there longer term.
So we are hearing already about the number of mortgage defaults, which are increasing. And of course, there was the announcement from the CMHC last week in regards to tighter restrictions for lending. What type of effects do you think these things will have on the housing continuum, most specifically homelessness?
Well, I think you'll probably see increased pressure on the rental market. So people that aren't able to own their home anymore may find themselves renting, and that would put pressure on the rental market. It may make it more difficult for people to move out of rental into housing. In places like Calgary, we know that we need at least 15,000 units of housing, rental housing, in order to make some progress. We've seen this. We've seen this movie before in Calgary, right? We've seen the impact of housing prices and challenges in the economy, for sure.
It's not my favorite film at all. Would you say that this will have a more significant impact where there was previously larger amounts of homeless, such as the GTA, Vancouver? Do you think it will have a greater impact, and perhaps Calgary as well, in those larger metro centers, or no?
I think it's tough to say, but I think anywhere you see people with lower incomes losing their employment and high housing costs, you see the pressure potentially to increase homelessness. But it can happen in large cities and in small cities. The dynamic is essentially the same. If there's a loss of employment and not a lot of housing available, you may see people entering the homeless system.
Sure. So, of course, we've seen the lack of success recently with the first-time home buyers program. Do you think that making home ownership more accessible to Canadians would do anything to ease the number of homeless and improve the situation?
Short answer is not really. I think longer term, I think organizations like Habitat for Humanity or some forms of attainable home ownership can actually move people out of social housing and out of rental housing. They can be an important part of the housing continuum. But if you think, people experiencing homelessness have to pay rent less than $750 a month in order to be able to get by.
Okay, thank you. What about recently within the pandemic? We've seen, of course, this was mentioned previously, a number of hotels used to house the homeless. Is this something that we see as a longer term response, or again, do you see this alleviating once the pandemic is over?
Brief response, please.
It certainly can be if those hotels can be renovated to be single room occupancy effectively. It can be an option.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cusey. Thank you, Mr. Richter. Finally, we'll go to Mr. Long, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn, please.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions to Mr. Richter. There's been discussion about not imposing standards on provinces when federal and provincial agreements are signed. You're from Alberta. In Alberta, the Alberta government has refused to spend federal dollars because they have to match them, and as a result, no dollars are being spent. Is there a risk to not demanding federal standards to add new money to housing systems to create new housing? If we don't put that in place, is there a risk that we just simply displace provincial housing and we sustain the status quo?
Yes, I think there's a risk that you end up using federal dollars, end up displacing provincial dollars, and the net benefit is negligible.
In fact, we've seen that in Saskatchewan and Alberta since the accords were signed. In terms of the call for supportive housing to be built, long-term care is a form of supportive housing. Is that the way, when you talk about supportive housing, do you include the long-term care sector in that calculation?
We haven't included the long-term care sector in the calculation of our housing, but what is effectively done in long-term care is supportive housing, and it's a form of supporting of housing for people who are aging. But a lot of what we propose as supportive housing is in fact the same as long-term care. Yeah.
So when other parties in Parliament say that when we invest into long-term care and create long-term care supports for provinces, but there needs to be federal standards and federal criteria attached to those dollars, why would we attach criteria in that sector of the housing market, but then walk away from establishing criteria in the rest of the country?
That's a great question. I think we should be looking at federal standards and expectations. And I mean, the federal government shouldn't be shy about setting clear expectations, about setting standards, and about having expectations for dollars that it's invested. I think that's basic duty to taxpayers.
And to be clear, you would support a government initiative that was capital intensive, was prioritized nonprofit housing providers to both acquire or renovate some of the housing that's being used to house homeless individuals during this crisis. You'd support a new chapter being added to the National Housing Strategy, particularly to sustain housing for COVID-related housing measures?
Yep, I think so. I think the challenge is there's only so much housing around to renovate. I mean, we see that challenge in Calgary specifically. But yes, it's an opportunity to move very quickly. But there's also other options like to build. But supporting the income of Canadians at risk of homelessness is actually much faster than building anything. And you may be able to. You're not going to build your way out of homelessness. You have to use income and construction. And supports for sure. Yeah.
So you also support the Canada Health Act being used to provide those supports and mandate them into community-based housing projects.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. To Mr. Simon, a quick question on Quebec. We're very close to signing an accord, but that accord, as Mr. Richter has identified, if we don't tie it to new housing and new housing supports, we may just allow the Quebec government to displace existing systems. Would that help Quebecers looking for housing if we didn't insist on new housing and new supports being mandatory as part of any agreement?
Well, I think that the government is trying to build new housing and making sure to deliver whatever you put it in or not. The question is, what's the accountability of the subsidy? So I think that the people in Quebec and the government do want new housing, want new development. They want to support the one that are existing at the end of convention. So whether I don't see any problem with or without, the question is, do it fast.
Right. So, but would you share Mr. Richter's concern that as the federal government puts money in the front door, if a provincial government were allowed to take money out the back door, the status quo would prevail, even though a new accord would have been signed?
Well, you have to go with the good faith. When somebody's clear that they won't use it is one thing, but when the government has the system in place and wants to use it in a different way or in ways, you have to make sure that you get the flexibility to make sure that the money goes down. So it's a question of nothing, everything or nothing. You have to make sure that there's something in between.
So prioritize flexibility, but make sure that you add capacity to the system, not just simply fund a system.
Exactly.
And if the federal accord is structured along that, you'd encourage the Quebec government to sign?
Well, I'm making sure. I don't want to get into political of using. No, but that's for sure. I'm looking at the project of people who are probably in bad housing situation that for 3 years, because of the bureaucratic knowledge of who's responsible for what. I don't want to know who's responsible. I want to make sure that the money's there and gets on the ground. And both government are well known and with the good faith can arrive to any understanding that this money needs to go down to the projects to build up.
Thank you, Mr. Simon, and thank you, Mr. Vaughn. We've reached the top of the hour. Mr. Simon, Mr. Richter, thank you very much for your thoughtful and thorough presentations and responses. They are of great assistance to the work of the committee, and we appreciate you being with us. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for 3 minutes while we get the sound check for the next panel of witnesses, so we are suspended. We do have with us from the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, Timothy Ross, Executive Director, and from the Namarand Housing Corporation, Robert Byers, President and CEO. I think we'll start with Mr. Ross, please. If you could proceed with your opening statement, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to present to the committee today. Again, my name is Tim Ross, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. CHF Canada is the national voice of the cooperative housing movement, representing over 2,200 housing cooperatives, home to over 250,000 people in every province and territory. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment and recognize our current social context and acknowledge that cooperatives are built on the values of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And it's in that, with that value of solidarity that I say that as long as systemic racism exists in our communities, we must and we will work to dismantle this injustice. And we as a sector stand with individuals and communities affected by systemic racism, violence, and discrimination, including police brutality against Black individuals, people of color, and Indigenous people here in Canada. Now on to the subject of your committee study. COVID-19 has reminded us that a safe, secure home is the foundation on which we build our lives. And not all Canadians had this prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. And we've seen how this pandemic has also brought to the surface the social and economic inequities that have been invisible or not prioritized here in Canada. When it comes to housing options, people often know they can buy and they can rent. But there's another choice out there that's underutilized, and that's cooperative housing. Housing cooperatives provide secure, at-cost housing for people of diverse backgrounds and incomes who work together democratically to make decisions about their housing. Housing cooperatives are owned by their members. They provide security of tenure, and they're affordable forever. For example, I'm speaking to you here in Ottawa, where a two-bedroom apartment costs on average well over $1,400 a month. A two-bedroom apartment in a cooperative in Ottawa costs approximately $1,000 per month. So in my report here, I'll inform the committee how the co-op housing sector has been affected by COVID-19 and provide some recommendations on how to curb the socioeconomic devastation brought on by this pandemic. As a general headline, housing cooperatives are weathering this storm. Because of their community focus, housing cooperatives by design are strong communities. They're able to weather economic and social hardship. And anecdotally across our membership, we've heard that housing charge or rental arrears have remained manageable in March, April, and May of this year. We believe this is evidence that the CERB and other income assistance programs are working and reaching the people in need to help them pay for rent and other necessities. CHF Canada and our partners will continue to monitor these trends in the coming months as the economy slowly starts to reopen across the country. Cooperatives in Canada and around the world adhere to 7 central business principles, making them distinct from other businesses. One of those principles is concern for community. And we have seen people taking this principle very seriously during this health crisis. We have heard countless stories of members checking in on each other, particularly their most vulnerable neighbors and the elderly, running errands, picking up groceries and prescriptions, coordinating childcare, and assisting in countless other ways through their strong community bonds. During the COVID-19 pandemic, CHF Canada's top priority has been the health and safety of our members and supporting their social and economic stability through COVID-19. CHF Canada supports the significant steps that the federal government has taken to flatten the curve and contain the spread of COVID-19, while also limiting its impact on the social and economic welfare of people and communities. We also appreciate that CMHC's early outreach, specifically to the community housing sector, was to commit. CMHC basically committed early on to commit to doing what it can within its mandate to ensure no housing loss in community housing during COVID-19. We also applaud the government's introduction of the various emergency income response programs, such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Since the beginning of the pandemic, CHF Canada has advised co-op members who could pay their housing charges to do so in order to protect the financial stability of their cooperative homes. COVID-19 has already highlighted what we already know. The current housing market does not address the housing needs of all Canadian families. Without sustainable action and investment in affordable housing, the disparities in our communities will only deepen and worsen, especially as eviction bans are lifted and emergency support funding ceases. CHF Canada is recommending that the federal government prioritize investments in housing as a part of its COVID-19 response and recovery plan. Further to that, we recommend that the federal government put housing at the center of its health, social, and economic response and recovery work. And to that end, I have a couple specific recommendations. One is relative to income or rental assistance. So let's recognize that COVID-19 is a global pandemic. COVID-19 is a pan-Canadian pandemic, and the economic, social, and health impacts are being felt from coast to coast to coast. So we need federal leadership to prevent housing loss due to COVID-19, both during the response and the recovery period to COVID-19. Yes, we all know that housing is under the jurisdiction of provinces and territories. However, the socioeconomic devastation from COVID-19 is universal and requires federal leadership and investment to prevent housing loss. We need to make sure that deferred rents of today don't become evictions of tomorrow. And we need strong income supports now and in the recovery phase to prevent housing loss. The second recommendation is relative to supply. We encourage the federal government to support the development of non-market, non-profit cooperative housing through both development and acquisition, and that includes housing cooperatives. Housing really does need to be the focal point of any social and economic recovery plan, and investments in affordable and co-op housing is not a radical idea. During the 70s and 80s, Canada developed many programs that successfully started most of the co-ops that exist today, sprouting up in every province and territory. These federal programs were cut in the 1990s or devolved to provinces, creating a shortage of affordable homes. Had these programs continued at their prior rate of growth and development, we'd have 500,000 more affordable homes across the country, and people would be able to weather the storm more effectively. Instead, we have what's already been reported by my colleague Tim Richter, a severe net loss of affordable rentals due to the financialization of housing following the 2008 recession. Let's learn from that recession and not make the same mistakes again. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not comment on the devastating loss of life among elders in long-term care. And our members of housing co-ops across the country, we're very committed to aging in place for our elderly members. Co-ops have been helping to adapt to their changing needs of members as they age in place so that they can stay independent and autonomous in their strong community. With the need for low-cost housing options for seniors continuing to grow, we recommend that the government consider investments in aging in place for housing providers such as co-ops. Considering the broad system impacts of our recommendations, it's paramount to take an integrated approach to the economic recovery planning in partnership with all levels of government, as well as sector organizations with the community-based housing experience and expertise. The co-op housing sector is well poised to work closely with public, private, and nonprofit partners to build the critical socioeconomic infrastructure needed to meet the pre-existing and growing housing needs in our communities. Our movement is resourceful, passionate, and dedicated to a future with more cooperatives as a housing option that are open, sustainable, and strong cooperatives. Amidst the significant level of public spending in response to COVID-19, investing in long-term solutions that support community well-being must be a top priority in economic recovery planning. This is the time for ambitious public investments in people and communities, and this is a time to invest in more non-market, not-for-profit housing, including cooperatives across the country. I really appreciate and thank you for the invitation here today, and I'll conclude on that statement and look forward to questions and dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross. Next, we're going to go to Canada Housing and Renewal Association, but we're going to start with Mr. Byers because I know Mr. Morrison has had some technical challenges. Mr. Byers, as between you and Mr. Morrison, you have a total of 10 minutes, so please bear that in mind, and you have the floor, sir. unmute your mic there, Mr. Byers.
That helps.
Yep, significantly.
Okay, yeah. So I'm the chair or the president and CEO of Navarin Housing Corporation, as well as the chair of the Canadian Housing Renewal Association's Indigenous Caucus. We have a membership of around 140 Indigenous housing and service providers from across Canada. Navarin is an Indigenous nonprofit housing provider here in Regina. Our mission is to provide safe and affordable quality housing and economic development opportunities for Indigenous people in Regina. In 1977, our community determined a great need for affordable housing for Indigenous people. Supply was an issue, but so was discrimination. We decided to take care of our own. Since then, that goal has led us on a journey that now includes so much more than a roof over the head of our tenants. We are giving opportunity back to the Indigenous community, the opportunity to create jobs, to create wealth, and to create a sense of ownership. We focus on the importance of each staff member as an integral part of this team: First Nations, Métis, non-Native, and visible minorities. We have also created community partnerships to better the broader Regina community. Together, we believe we can provide safe, affordable, self-sustained housing to all those in need. We wholeheartedly support the Truth and Reconciliation's principles, as well as the calls to action. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency. As Canadians, we share the responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. We have to be honest about where we are. My focus today is on Regina's Indigenous homeless population. The most recent point-in-time count of homeless people in Regina was done in 2018. Now, Indigenous people make up 9% of Regina's population. They are 79% of the homeless population. Across Canada, Indigenous people are struggling and homeless. In the same year, a point-in-time count was done in Toronto. In the general population, Indigenous people represent 1 to 2.5%. They are 16% of the homeless population there and 38% of the outdoor population. Regina shelters are typical dormitory style with as many beds per square foot as possible, and they are full. But why are Indigenous homeless people not sleeping in shelters? Why are so many of them on the streets of Regina, or the streets of Toronto for that matter? Many of our people struggle with mental health and dependency issues. The ensuing chaos makes it unlikely they will be organized enough to get a bed. But that is true of many non-Indigenous people as well. Where are our people sadly unique is that we have grown up with the unimaginable damage that we, our parents, and our grandparents have endured in residential schools. We grew up and share their pain. The images are seared in all of our brains. You know, when I think of residential schools, I see in my mind those pictures of those terrified Indigenous kids in dormitories. For us, shelters aren't merely grim. They trigger despair. You know, it's really hard to be homeless in Regina. We saw a young Indigenous man walking down the street in Regina on one of our coldest days in January of this year, just as we were starting to wrap our heads around COVID-19. It was minus 43 degrees and he was dragging 2 shopping carts. Everybody drove by. We were in shock that anyone was walking outside in such cold temperatures. We called our maintenance workers to pick him up and his belongings and bring him back to our office. We tried reaching out to numerous shelters to no avail. Because it was 2 p.m., we could not use the after-hours line of social services. Every line we called told us to call somewhere else. It was frustrating. We gave him a furnished apartment where we reduced his rent, got him a telephone so he was able to make appointments. Over the next 4 months, we worked with this young man to keep a roof over his head, to attend appointments, and to start building a relationship with his mother. He applied for social assistance for his rent in February and finally received a payment on April 29th. I'm not sure where anyone could live without rent payment for 4 months. This is the reason why people remain homeless in Regina. It is also hard to help a homeless person. Resources are scarce or non-existent. Existing shelters offer help for tonight, but not for tomorrow. Prior to this young man getting help from NAMRIN, he spent his days walking the city. He slept in banks at night. He ate from garbage cans and shared the food he found with other homeless people. In order to stay warm, he would plug in a toaster oven, and that's how he kept his hands warm. Yeah, he's still our tenant, and this young man and his mother are beyond grateful for the help that we've given them. Our sense is now that the number of Indigenous people who are homeless in Regina is much bigger post the onset of COVID-19. We see elders, mothers, and kids that COVID-19 has forced onto the streets. They were precariously housed before and have been forced to leave by anxious hosts. We certainly are not used to seeing them in such numbers. They have nowhere to go. The places they access for food were closed for many weeks because of COVID. Donations were left outside and frequently plundered, so nothing was left. We see long lines of Indigenous elders, moms, and kids lined up at churches for dinner. For many of them, it's the only meal they get that day. COVID-19 has laid bare the magnitude of the problem. Our 5 shelters were not prepared for social distancing. How could they be when the design of those shelters was to fit in as many bodies as possible? Some of them simply closed during the early weeks of emergency measures. NAMRIN is in the business of housing Indigenous people. We could see right away what was badly needed, and we knew we could help. We need a capital investment to provide transformational private accommodation with priority given to elders, women, and children. Housing is our business, so we quickly found a suitable downtown site for sale that could be easily refurbished. It has a commercial kitchen, dining area, and because it is a motel, plenty of individual rooms that can provide social distancing in the short run and privacy in the long run. We will need a directly funded service provider to run the facility and provide appropriate services. Our goal is to welcome the residents to a NAMRIN apartment or house when they are ready. Our transitional housing will truly be transformational. Unlike shelters, we will work with partners to put mental health and addiction supports in place. We want our people to recover, not just have a roof over their head. We have 2 recommendations. Canada needs to recognize that 87% of Indigenous people live in Canada's cities. They deserve a housing program that addresses their needs. The Canadian Housing Renewal Association's Indigenous Caucus has recommended that the federal government needs to introduce an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. Recommendation 2, provide $2 million to NAMRIN Housing to purchase 1009 Albert Street in Regina so it can be converted into COVID-compliant Indigenous transitional housing. In summary, Regina has an Indigenous homelessness crisis. It's hard to be homeless in Regina. COVID-19 laid bare the shortcomings of the existing shelter system and forced elders, moms, and kids onto the streets. The legacy of residential housing means Indigenous people are more at risk and reject dormitory housing. We have a plan to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byers. Mr. Morrison, there's about a couple of minutes left if you have anything you want to add before we open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies. Of course, the one time my computer and internet would go down would be right now. So this is what we call improvisation. So thank you. And as some of you know, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association is the national association representing the social, nonprofit, and affordable housing sector in Canada. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my board member, Robert Byers, who you just heard from. I would add that during this pandemic, social and nonprofit housing providers have played a vital role, often under the radar and rarely acknowledged by the media. Housing providers have maintained safe and affordable housing for approximately 600,000 households across the country, many of whom are low income or vulnerable. They've worked with community advisory boards and local governments to secure short-term housing solutions for homeless populations, which has been aided by the one-time $157 million in extra financing provided through Reaching Home. Housing providers have provided a range of social supports and services to tenants, often at great personal risk, given that access to personal protective equipment for providers has been a significant problem. And they worked with tenants to find solutions to loss of income or employment, such that no tenant has been forced to leave due to inability to pay rent. As an example, in British Columbia, a survey of housing providers was done, which indicated 46% of housing providers in the province had deferred or waived rent for some of those tenants. But despite this good work, housing providers are of course being impacted by the pandemic. Based on some surveys and feedback we've received, there's been a couple quick lessons we've learned. For example, the number of units in arrears or units unable to pay rent has been actually relatively low, about 10 to 15%. This is because, in part, seniors who live in some of these units are living on fixed income, and therefore the pandemic has had limited financial impact. And federal support programs such as CERB have helped mitigate the impact. Another reason, though, that arrears have been so low is that many units in nonprofit housing are a rent geared to income model, meaning that rents are calculated as a proportion of a person's income. So as a person's income goes down due to impacts such as loss of employment, the rent they pay goes down. Now, although this assists the tenant, it has a negative financial impact for the housing provider, as their total revenue also goes down. And a final difficulty faced by providers is many units are in fact sitting vacant. Because of physical distancing and cleansing requirements, housing providers are not often able to rent out units to prospective tenants during this period. Quebec has said this is a problem, and in BC, that aforementioned survey I referenced, 17% of respondents indicated that they were experiencing vacancies due to the pandemic, which not only reduces income, but of course reduces housing.
Mr. Morrison, I'm gonna get you to wrap up if you could, please.
Sure.
We're anxious to get to questions, and you'll be able to get a lot of your points out through the questions. So if you could just wrap it up, that'd be great. Thanks.
So I'll wrap up with 3 quick points we would like to propose in terms of recommendation. One, that the Canada Housing Benefit, which was originally introduced in the National Housing Strategy, be fully implemented. Right now, there's only one province that has signed the National Housing Benefit Agreement, Ontario. We need all the others. Number 2, the federal government needs to introduce an acquisitions program and policy, which would allow nonprofit providers to acquire properties such that they could be converted into long-term permanent housing. And number 3, if there is a post-pandemic relief package, and we hope there is, that housing be at the centerpiece of that package. It would not only create jobs and economic activity, but would address social ills and better prepare us for the next pandemic to come. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do look forward to those questions.
And thank you, Mr. Morrison and Mr. Byers. And we will now proceed with rounds of questions, beginning with the Conservatives. Mr. Viss, please, for 6 minutes.
There we go. Thank you, Chair. And just before I start with my questions, I do need to make a point. In this committee 1 month ago today, I asked for timely statistical information from Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada officials within 2 weeks, which you, Chair, said was completely reasonable. We're on to 20 business days now and double the original timeline. It was relayed to my office last week that IRCC officials have actually completed these responses, but their transmission to this committee is being held up in the final stage of this process. What I understand that it's likely sitting on the desk of a political staffer waiting for approval. I certainly hope that that's not the intention. I'm just going to make it known that I really want to receive that information so I can do my job on behalf of my constituents. Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Viss, can you just move your mic a little further from your mouth?
Yes, there we go, sir. Sorry about that.
Good.
Is that better?
Madam Clerk, is that better?
How's this?
It is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So my first question goes to Mr. Ross from the Co-op Society. I like the fact that co-ops are independently and community owned in Canada. I think it's a great model. And I also understand that the many co-ops across Canada are retiring their first mortgages through CMHC. I'm just wondering what co-ops that are retiring their mortgages, how they can use their assets to develop more units. Could you maybe comment on that, please?
Absolutely, and thanks for the question. We do know as co-ops come to the end of their operating agreements and their forced mortgages, there's two really big things that happen. One is low-income households living in housing cooperatives lose a subsidy or an operating a rental assistance subsidy that allows them to stay affordably housed. So that's why it's been the focus of our movement to campaign for the renewal of rental assistance programs or the creation of new rental assistance programs, which have come in as a part of the National Housing Strategy through the Federal Community Housing Initiative and the Canada Community Housing Initiative. The delivery of that program those programs has not been uniform across the different provinces and territories, so there's a lot to be preoccupied and concerned about there. The second piece is we're talking about 30, 40-year-old buildings, and some of these were actually acquisitions and rehabilitations, so they require significant reinvestments for modernization. Now, what we've done as a sector is we have created financing programs to link co-ops up with their credit unions to do a long-term asset management plan and to finance long-term modernization and repair. So once the preoccupation with rental assistance for low-income households is addressed and resolved, once the repair and renewal question is resolved, of which we've already through our programming across the sector, we've already tapped into about $130 million in credit union lending to help with the modernization of cooperatives. Then we also have some capacity, and we do see this within some of our members, that they are looking to buy some land, acquire something, build something new. We're just on the cusp of this new wave of growth of housing cooperatives. However, it is a highly competitive and expensive housing market out there, and we're really outbid and outpositioned by the big guys, and so that makes it really hard to develop new autonomously owned, locally owned cooperative homes.
Thank you. Given that the co-ops are community and independently owned by their respective members, I guess some co-ops want to participate in some of these broader federal initiatives, but other co-ops with the retirement of their mortgage might see it in their interest just to keep their rates very low for their members and to kind of go on alone. Would that be an accurate understanding of some co-ops across Canada?
I mean, it is a very diverse movement, and I wouldn't want to paint with broad brushes. I would say that as a sector, we've been working with our members to help make sure that they have really good governance, sound management, good long-term asset management and financing to keep these homes in a good state of repair, not only for today's generation, but the next generation, to provide a permanent affordability for today's members and future members living in housing cooperatives. So, but we do see a lot of interest in rehabilitation, modernization, as well as new growth. In fact, our members, through a democratic motion 2 years ago at our General Assembly, supported very broadly a growth mandate to build new co-op homes. So there's certainly interest and concern for community to offer more Canadians a co-op home.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. And I know in Vancouver and even in Abbotsford, where I live, when co-op spaces do become available, many families do rush to get those spots because they're so sought after, and they provide safe places for many Canadians of all socioeconomic backgrounds to live in. Mr. Byers, turning to you for my remaining time, what's your experience been in terms of getting money from either Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada or Indigenous Services Canada? Do you find the bureaucratic process overly complicated? And would you say that Ottawa is always very responsive to the needs of Indigenous people in Regina?
Short answer, please, Mr. Byers.
Yeah, we haven't actually worked with Indigenous Services, anything like that. Okay. We've worked with another ministry and with CMHC.
Thank you, Mr. Byers, and thank you, Mr. Viss. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Young, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Morrison and Mr. Byers and Mr. Ross for appearing today. First, I wanted to pass along my thanks through the three of you, to all of the frontline workers in the affordable housing sector who are truly doing heroic work in supporting those living in our communities during this crisis. And I just wanted to make mention of that to start. Mr. Ross, I did want to ask you, you mentioned in your presentation that during COVID, rental arrears are manageable for housing cooperatives. I wanted to ask you about this because when the government introduced the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, it was hoping to support those individuals and families who saw their income evaporate. Can you tell us whether you have seen a significant reduction in the number of people paying rent?
No, there's not been widespread reported cases of a significant number of people not paying rent. In fact, our message to our members is that if you have the means to pay rent, you should pay your rent, or as we say in co-op land, housing charges, because that is not only how you keep a roof over your own head, but that's how you keep a roof over your neighbor's heads as well within your co-op. So far, the reported levels of arrears remain manageable. By that, I mean around less than 10%. But I think we really do need to study very closely who is falling behind and why, so that we can make sure that they can access some support to remain stably housed so that there's no housing loss due to COVID-19.
Do you see the CERB benefit as playing a role in this and during COVID?
I think this would require further study, but these are we don't have any firm way of correlating between the manageable rental arrears in housing cooperatives and the availability of the CERB. That should be studied, I think, but anecdotally, we are hearing that the CERB is allowing those with economic loss and job loss due to COVID-19. It is providing them with the means to pay their housing charge and meet their other basic needs.
Which certainly helps. Thank you very much. And I'd like to also talk to Mr. Byers. We have a Namarin Friendship Center in London, and so I'm familiar with the name Namarin. And you gave us a very personal account of a homeless Indigenous man in Regina, and it was a tragic story, all too common. And this committee was planning an in-depth study of this issue before the COVID-19 pandemic of urban and rural Indigenous housing strategy. Can you tell us whether you believe this issue should remain our first post-pandemic priority, and why this issue is so critical?
Thank you. It's so important to us. Even sitting on the board of Canadian Housing Renewal Association, as I said, I chair the Indigenous Caucus. We've invested money and worked with CMHC actually to develop our for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy. And I do believe we've presented it to the federal government, and it talks about a strategy that is specific to urban, rural, and northern Indigenous people. It's different for us, and we need something that is specific to us.
Well, I hope, Mr. Byers, when we do have that study, and I certainly hope that study will be forthcoming soon, that you'll be able to come back and be a witness during that testimony too. Thank you. Mr. Morrison, if I could just go to you briefly, and you talked about some of the things. You didn't have much time to talk about what you were hoping for. I'll give you the rest of the time to tell us more about what you would like. I think you're still on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, and just to reinforce the point, the study that your committee had proposed on urban, rural, northern, as just to reiterate Robert's point, it is so crucial, and we look forward to working. Our Indigenous Caucus looks forward to working with you on that. As Robert mentioned, we have a lot of data, a lot of information to provide. Just to reiterate one point I quickly got in at the end of my comments. I think in terms of the post-pandemic world, as it relates to affordable housing, probably the most important recommendation we're putting forth is the notion of a federal acquisitions program. in a very sad way. Perhaps the only population that may be sad to see this pandemic end is in fact the homeless population. Because as you know, many municipalities, many housing providers have currently acquired properties on a very short-term basis to provide housing for homeless people. The problem is when the pandemic is over, those arrangements will also be over, meaning those homeless people are back out on the street. If we can put in a place that would allow municipalities and providers to acquire those properties on a long-term basis to complement the other measures already in the National Housing Strategy, then we can actually, in a very sad, tragic situation of this pandemic, turn it into an opportunity to put a real dent in homelessness while at the same time providing safe, affordable housing to those who really need it.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison, and thank you, Ms. Young. Suite la parole.
Now, Mrs. Chabot, 6 minutes. Thank you. Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to allow you to fill this in. I think you know, I speak about this regularly if we talk about the national strategy for housing and the bilateral accord with Quebec. It's still not been signed. So this is the only province that has no signed agreement. The needs are huge, and they were very, very pressing before COVID, and now they still are. And we're talking about affordable housing, social affordable housing, safe housing. And according to you, I think that in the correspondence that you forwarded, you seem to believe it's important as well to sign this agreement. Could you explain to us why? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Quebec is the only province, as you know, who has not signed this agreement. I will continue in English.
I'm going to continue in English.
Conversation with Minister Hussein, perhaps about 2 weeks ago now, in which we reiterated the importance of finalizing an agreement with the government of Quebec to implement the measures. As the only jurisdiction that is not signed, and it's been 2.5 years since we've had the strategy. So as the only jurisdiction to not sign, Quebec is missing out on the investments targeted for affordable housing in the province of Quebec. And the people, the tenants within Quebec are not able to benefit from that agreement. We understand over the weekend that CMHC has put forth a new offer to the government of Quebec, responding to some of their concerns. So we hope that the government of Quebec will seriously entertain those, and we can get an agreement signed. Because yes, it's simply taking 2.5 years to come up with an agreement is simply too long, and we need those investments today.
Puis à votre avis,
and could this have changed matters if this agreement had been finalized 3 years ago? I know that the conditions in Quebec, one witness told us earlier, there is an ecosystem already in Quebec, and we believe that Quebec needs to play its part in this agreement. But the ecosystem needs to be respected. Do you believe that it would have improved matters if the agreement had been finalized 3 years ago?
The situation, especially during the pandemic, would have been better had Quebec signed sooner. It does take some time for some of these policies and building building properties to be built and put in place. However, since other jurisdictions have signed their agreements on the national housing strategy, we have seen literally billions of dollars flow to other provinces and other housing providers to repair and renew existing housing units, to build new units, to continue the rental subsidies. So had Quebec signed a year, 2 years ago, I think that we could have definitely seen a better situation for the province of Quebec than we are at present. But history is what it is, and so hopefully the government will sign soon and we can get moving on those investments.
And we shall hope that the federal government removes its constraints. Last question for Mr. Ross. You said that when we talk about affordable housing, I think often of cooperative and social housing, but it still needs to be affordable, because we know that these new housing units need to be very secure and safe, and that many women need that type of housing. Could you tell us a bit more about the offer concerning the cooperatives, Mr. Ross?
I think generally, you are absolutely correct. Community, not-for-profit, and cooperative housing that gets developed does need to be affordable in order to meet the needs of community. And given how expensive and competitive and difficult it is to operate and develop housing in our highly financialized, investment and profit-driven housing system across the country, that's why there needs to be a role for the federal and provincial governments to invest in the development or acquisition of new housing supply through favorable financing, through grants, to make housing more affordable to operate. As well, individuals need adequate income supports. If they are precarious, if they're precarious workers, or if they have precarious health, or if they don't have reliable labor participation, it is very difficult to meet your housing costs and the other costs associated with your day-to-day living. So that is why income support programs need to be very broad and robust and sufficient to meet people's housing needs and other essential needs.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Merci, Madame Chabot. Next, we have Ms. Kwan, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their presentation. I'm going to first start with Mr. Ross, carrying on the issue around co-op housing. As you indicated, the federal government pretty well pulled out of the housing, building of housing back in the 1990s, and included with that is, of course, co-op housing. The impact has been great. The government is engaging in the renewal of operating agreements, another round of short-term renewal. And what I hear from the co-op sector is that as we sort of keep on talking about renewal of agreements, we're not really talking about new stock, right? Because we're just trying to sort of stay afloat at this moment. So I wonder if you can quickly comment about what we really need to do in terms of would you support for the federal government to come back with a co-op housing program similar to the one that was dismantled before? And in terms of the renewal, can we actually, would you have any recommendations in terms of the length of term for the renewal and associated with it the requirements for the subsidies in terms of renewal in keeping up with the cost of living increases and so on?
Thank you very much for the question. With respect to the best path to create new non-market supply of housing, including cooperatives, it would seem as though there are difficulties in accessing and generating new development opportunities through the federal co-investment fund. And I know that a lot of work has been underway to make that work more favorably for smaller nonprofits and smaller co-ops. I know CMHC is allowing for now a portfolio approach to access that financing and those that favorable financing and those grants. However, we continue to advocate for a not-for-profit, non-market co-op supply program through the federal government, ideally with participation of provinces. It's very difficult to and may not be reasonable to expect co-op and nonprofit housing in Canada, which is a universe of just over 600,000 units, to compete with the whole private market when applying for these existing programs. So a standalone program would certainly help with that. To the second point of renewal of agreements with co-ops and nonprofits, what's really important, what must happen is we need to separate income support from ongoing operations and management of buildings. So co-ops and nonprofits in Canada are very well positioned to look after the buildings. We need strong income support programs to help those who don't have enough income to pay an economic rent. So the current programs that are on the table, there's really three of them in the National Housing Strategy. It's the Housing Benefit, it's the Federal Community Housing Initiative, and it's the Canada Community Housing Initiative. They're all slated to be they're all 10-year programs at the beginning of the strategy. Now we're a few years into the strategy. Not all of them are up and running. So really want to focus on getting those up and running. Generally longer term, more permanent or stable rental assistance programs should be more than a decade.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. I wonder if you have additional recommendations of what needs to be done, if you can submit that to the clerk's office. I'm limited in time, so I want to actually turn to Mr. Byers now. Thank you so much for your presentation and highlighting the situation with the urban, northern, and remote Indigenous communities. In my own riding in Vancouver East here, we have a large homeless population, urban Indigenous folks as well. The National Housing Strategy, as if you have noted, do not actually focus in these sectors, and then that's a huge problem. In the $2 million to which you requested, have you actually asked the federal government for that funding? Mr. Byers, have we lost him?
No, I didn't. I still had you on mute.
Oh.
Actually, I did. I sent a letter. Really, it wasn't applying through any sort of a program. It was just an ask, because I think it will really transform the shelter system here in Regina. And I think it's something that could be replicated across the country, actually. It's because shelters aren't set up for something like this. You know, it's like I had said in my presentation, they're usually set up in dormitory style. And if you've grown up or experienced the residential schools, it's horrible to go back to that. Most people would sooner sleep on the street than go back to it. I know a friend of mine and myself took to the streets a few weeks ago to feed people. And that's what they talked about, sleeping outside.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, in my own riding, we actually have a group of Indigenous people who are homeless and in the dead of winter, desperate for housing. But at the same time, even putting them in a shelter, they were saying that they couldn't stay there. Why? Because it reminded them too much of the residential school experience, and it was just too traumatic, and they actually went outside. And so therefore, they need housing developed by them, initiated by them to meet their needs and not by someone else's definition of what is deemed to be appropriate. So I thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. That's your time. Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Falk, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to thank all the witnesses for coming today and for all the work that you all are doing. I just wanted to make a quick note. Mr. Ross, I completely agree with you regarding community bonds. I see this definitely in a rural riding. Having other people in the community, even in a non-housing way is so important for the health of people and their mental health. Mr. Byers, I also wanted to make a comment too. I was a social worker previously, and so one of the things that actually led me kind of into politics was the having an influence on the macro, being able to dismantle some of that red tape, because I have been on the phone with social services, whether it was Alberta or Saskatchewan, and them saying, oh, not my issue, not my issue, not my issue. And it gets very frustrating at the end of the day. And so I guess I would like to direct my first question to Jeff Morrison with the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. I know in your open letter to Minister Hussen on May 13th, you had made a point that affordable housing should be a key component of a post-pandemic economic response. And in that letter, you mentioned simplifying and expanding existing programs like the Federal Lands Initiative. So this program is a federal program that can certainly be utilized to help tackle affordable housing. During the election, we did put forward a proposal to make surplus federal real estate available for affordable housing, to reinvigorate the Federal Lands Initiative, and to reward municipalities that cut red tape for home building. So I'm just wondering, in your view, what role could the Federal Lands Initiative play in responding to housing needs, and how can this program be reformed or reinvested in to better respond to the current housing needs?
Just have to unmute yourself there.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the question, and you're absolutely correct. The Federal Lands Initiative represents an opportunity for housing providers to really grow the stock of supply that they have. Let's face it, you cannot build a new property unless you first have the land. So during the last election campaign, we actually put forth a proposal for a revamped Federal Lands Initiative. It would provide for the ability of the federal government not just to transfer its own surplus federal land, but possibly to acquire surplus municipal, provincial, territorial, possibly even private sector land, and then transfer that land to nonprofit providers on the condition that they build new affordable supply. That would require an increase in its funding. Under the National Housing Strategy, the Federal Lands Initiative went from $2 million per year to $20 million per year. Tenfold increase, but $20 million worth of land across Canada still does not get you a lot of land required to build new supply. So we think that with a revamped program that would have an expanded mandate, but also additional investments, then you would be much better placed as a government to stimulate additional supply across the country.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I guess as a follow-up, and if any of the other witnesses would also like to comment, I would appreciate that. I'm wondering, how does the red tape and the bureaucracy impact our housing goals? How does it impact having all this red tape? How does it impact our end housing goals?
I can give one quick answer to that. Under the National Housing Strategy, the largest program was the National Co-Investment Fund, the $14 billion fund intended to invest in both repair and renewal of existing units and build new units. There are a lot of housing providers across the country who are not applying for that fund, even though it is well resourced, because of the bureaucratic hurdles that are required to access the funding. The form itself is about 200 questions. If you're a small housing provider, that's difficult just to fill in the form. It's also lacking in clarity in terms of the ratio of grant to loan that an eligible housing provider would receive. So I think that's a good example where the bureaucratic makeup of the program is in and of itself a disincentive to apply for the program, even though it's funded to the tune of about $14 billion.
Does any other witnesses have a comment quickly?
This is Robert. I can say that it's a costly endeavor, the co-investment. Like Jeff said, the time involved, and when you're a small non-for-profit, when you put your resources into one project or program, it takes from many others. And we've been working on one project for quite some time, and it is it's costly in the way. I mean, you're always paying the wages of people, but you hate to spend so much all in one area, not knowing what the return will be, or if there will be a return.
Thank you, Mr. Byers, and thank you, Ms. Falk. We're going to finish up with Mr. Dong, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank all the panelists for coming here today. I will share my time, or actually 3 minutes, with Mr. Vaughn. I'll go first to Mr. Ross. First of all, I'm a big fan of co-op housing because I think they're sustainable and builds a strong community. And I do agree that the recovery phase of COVID-19 may present lots of opportunities for increase in co-op housing in our country. My riding, the percentage of renters has grown rapidly versus the homeowners. And I remember in my previous life as an MPP, the previous Ontario administration put aside $3 million to help co-op organizations to develop plans and apply and access other funds from other levels of government. Has that money started to flow?
I'm sorry. Which program are you referring to? And are you referring to a provincial?
Yeah, in Ontario, there was $3 million and put aside to help the co-op organizations to put together their applications, their planning, so they can start building, adding stock in Toronto.
Well, I'm not sure if the current provincial government decided to continue with that program or not. So we'd be happy to speak with with Minister Clark and his team about new supply of co-op housing. In fact, we do quite often, and we have a very good relationship with Minister Clark as well. So that's the thing. Everybody loves co-ops, but we need a new supply program in order to build co-ops.
In your mind, what's the best way to get more co-op built in Toronto, given that the cost of development and acquisition could be a challenge, and also there's a density issue as well in Toronto? Very quickly.
Well, you have the whole Sidewalk Labs has just exited and a massive development opportunity. So that may be an opportunity for governments to work together to increase the supply of non-market housing, particularly in Toronto. But what governments really need to cooperate on, if you want non-market housing built in your ridings, you need a supply program that provides favorable financing, significant grants to address the equity gap, and you need to pair it with income supports to house the most vulnerable. So look at all the current national housing strategy programs, and does any program has any program since it started created a reliable output of a significant increase of new co-op housing? Well, no, it hasn't. We're really willing to work with all existing programs, but if you want a specific outcome of new housing co-ops, you need a non-market housing supply and acquisition program.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. To Mr. Vaughn.
Thanks very much. And so, Mr. Ross, to be clear, what you're saying is a stronger capital program. The financing system works, and the Canada Housing Benefit, if the province was to deliver it, would actually meet those three criteria.
Quite potentially, yes. I mean, if we had more, and what we actually called for in our last pre-budget submission was just a modest start of a $300 million earmarked new supply program to provide financing. Yeah, provide financing for capital, but also grants to address the equity gap.
I've only a couple of seconds to Mr. Byers. The BC government wanted us to transfer all of the Reaching Home dollars to the provincial capital and have the provincial capital choose which frontline organizations worked. If this was done in Saskatchewan, do you think your organization would get any money? Mr. Byers? If I could repeat the question,
Yes, I heard that. I'd prefer that the money went to the provider, the service provider, because when I think of if it came to us, I think that really speaks to reconciliation. And in my presentation, I spoke a little bit about reconciliation. And I think sometimes money can go from federal to provincial, and by the time it gets to provincial, how they're going to spend it can change. And for me, I I strongly, my hopes, I guess, are that it would go to the provider.
And a quick follow-up question. You had an application for that shelter. It's in front of our government now as we seek to try and figure out how to build out of COVID. But the same application went in front of a local city council in your city. Were you successful? And if you weren't successful, where did the money go to?
Yeah, weren't, and I don't know.
But you put an application into city council.
We talked about for the homelessness strategy, and in the same council meeting where they decided that there wasn't a clear plan in place, they said, so they voted to give $20,000 in support of it. But in that same meeting, they actually voted in favor of the support of a $20 million building for the Humane Society. But the upsetting part in that for me was when they said it was to house homeless pets.
So homeless pets.
Thank you, Mr. Byers, and thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Thank you both. And thanks to all of the witnesses. We're a little past our allotted time. Your testimony has been thorough and appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Morrison, for working through the technical challenges. It was good to have you all here. Very much appreciate what you had to say. It will be important to our work. Colleagues, thank you very much. We will see you, I believe, on Friday, and we have a subcommittee meeting before that to talk about the rest of our plans. So with that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Au revoir.